It's now November, and here in the UK the weather has taken a bit of a turn over the last few weeks. It's gone from definitely summer to definitely autumn, and although today is actually quite a sunny day, the temperature is only about 6 degrees centigrade. So along with the changing weather comes a change of bike too. So unless there's a period of nice weather through the winter, I'm going to be putting my Orbea Gain e-bike away until the spring. In the meantime, I'll be riding this, my gravel bike, fully acoustic, non-electric, human-powered gravel bike. This is the 4th time I'm out on this gravel bike since I put my e-bike away. So I thought now is a good time to contrast and compare my Orbea Gain e-bike with this fully acoustic gravel bike. It's going to be purely subjective. Before I start telling you about the comparison, I better tell you a bit more about myself and the way I ride the bike, as that information may affect how you interpret what I am saying. I have got a body mass of about 87 kilograms, and once I've got all my cycling kit on, I'm around about 90 kilos. To the north, the landscape is almost totally flat. Indeed, some of it is below sea level. However, to the south, to the west, and to the east, the terrain is a bit more undulating. Although the highest point is only around about 150 meters above sea level, there are quite a lot of small hills, so the amount of climbing that I do can accumulate. Typically over, say, 100 kilometers, I might do between 600 and 800 meters of climbing. I tend to ride the e-bike like I would the acoustic bike, putting in roughly the same amount of effort, mostly. That results in an average speed of around about 26 or 27 kilometers an hour, above the cutoff speed for the e-bike. So most of the time the motor is not doing any work. When it really does cut in is when I'm climbing some of those small hills and when there's a strong headwind. There is another scenario where the motor cuts in, but I'll cover that at the end. Now, I normally have the motor set on either on level 1 or level 2. I rarely go into level 3. Sitting outside that cafe was rather cold, so I decided to ride home and finish this video here in my shed. Until a few weeks ago, I hadn't ridden my acoustic gravel bike for several months. And when I first jumped on it, I was struck not by the lack of power from an e-bike motor, but just how comfortable it was. Now, I put that down to a number of reasons. First of all, the geometry is slightly different. For instance, this has a slightly longer wheelbase than my e-bike. The handlebars, well, it's actually a handlebar and stem combination, are a little bit more flexible than on my e-bike. And I've been using this 3D printed saddle. By the way, I've got a review of this 3D printed saddle coming up. So if you don't want to miss that, press the subscribe icon or the 5-minute roundel at the end of this video. However, I don't think those are the major reasons for the extra comfort. As shown here, the tyres on my e-bike are 30mm in section, and I normally pump them up to about 65 psi in the rear and about 55 to 60 psi in the front. However, on my gravel bike, the tyres are actually nominally 36mm wide, and I pump them up to 10 to 15 psi less than on my e-bike. So I think a lot of that comfort is coming through the extra cushioning that these wider, lower pressure tyres give me. Whatever the reason, the extra comfort from my gravel bike was quite marked. Now, the central part of this video is about comparing an acoustic bike, my gravel bike, to an e-bike, that's my Orbea Gain. And the main difference is not really about comfort, it's about not having an electric motor versus having an electric motor.
So let's look at that next. First of all, let's cover me riding solo. Now, when I'm riding on my own, I generally put in about the same amount of effort on both the acoustic bike and my e-bike. That results in me going usually around 26 to 28 kilometers an hour on the flat, and therefore a lot of the time when I'm on my e-bike, I'm not engaging the motor. So from that respect, there's no difference between my acoustic bike and my e-bike. However, there's a difference when it comes to going up hills and into strong headwinds. In those situations, I might slow down below 25 kilometers an hour, and therefore the e-bike motor kicks in. Now, obviously, that does help me. So where there are hills and strong headwinds, I tend to ride my e-bike a bit faster than my acoustic bike. Interestingly, well, I think it's interesting anyway, my gravel bike back here actually feels a bit better than my e-bike when going up hills, particularly when I'm climbing out of the saddle. Now, I could put that down to the lighter weight of the acoustic bike. It's around 4 to 5 kilos lighter, but it also could be down to the gearing selection that I've got and many other factors. And in terms of the effort that I put in, I tend to, when riding my acoustic bike, just change down a gear or two and go up the hills or into the headwinds a bit slower. So I'm putting in roughly the same amount of effort. However, when I'm going down hills, on the flat, and maybe with a strong tailwind, I obviously exceed the 25 kilometers an hour cutoff speed for the e-bike motor, and therefore I'm doing all the work. In doing all that work, I do feel that the e-bike actually has slightly more resistance when I'm going at, say, 30 kilometers an hour, and it's particularly noticeable at speeds of, say, 40 kilometers an hour or higher. I can just feel a bit of extra resistance, a bit of extra friction from the rear hub motor. It's not a lot, but I can detect it. So overall, on a fairly longish ride, 50 to 100 kilometers, I feel that the e-bike will probably be doing 1 to 2 kilometers an hour faster than my fully acoustic gravel bike. Obviously, that depends on the conditions, but that's sort of an average figure. Now, I do a lot of my riding with my local club, Cambridge Cycling Club. And when I'm riding with my cycling buddies, we ride as a group.
Hello, group.
And the group tends to set the speed. So my effort is not dictated by me, but by the speed of the group. Now, that's an important dynamic difference from riding alone. And when I was last out with my local club mates, one of them commented that they thought I was just as fast on my acoustic gravel bike as I was on my e-bike. Now, I probably wouldn't disagree with that statement. However, that generalized statement does mask over some important differences between riding my acoustic bike and my e-bike. As when riding alone, the e-bike definitely helps me on the hills. Whereas on the flats and the downhills, I tend to be going above the cutoff speed of the motor, and therefore I have to put in a little bit more effort due to that extra friction in the hub. It is only a small amount though, but it's noticeable. Now, I could say saving effort on the hills and putting more in on the downhills and the tailwind sections sort of even each other out, and that's probably true. They do in terms of speed. However, in terms of fatigue, that is my fatigue, there is a big difference, because when I'm going up the hills on the e-bike, I don't need to elevate my heart rate so much, and that means I get less tired, less fatigued. Indeed, this is just what I wanted when I purchased my e-bike. I can compensate when riding my acoustic bike, and that's just going slower. Although I must admit, I find that difficult sometimes. I particularly noticed this lack of fatigue in a ride that is referenced up here. I was using my e-bike, but my cycling buddies were on their acoustic bikes, and near the end of the 100-mile ride, we hit a hilly section, and I felt that I was probably climbing better, not just because I had a motor, but because I was less fatigued than my cycling buddies. Now, I've talked a lot about fatigue. That's because about 5 years ago I had a stroke, and that has had some important effects on my brain and the way it works. When riding, if I put in too much effort, I get tired, and that in turn can affect the way my eyesight works. So if I get too fatigued, I find that my vision will become a bit tunneled. I also develop some disequilibrium. That in turn then also makes me feel a bit nauseous. So for me, it's important not to put in high levels of effort, particularly for extended periods of time. And that's really where the e-bike comes in. It takes off some of that high level effort, and therefore I become less fatigued. Now, I can have good days and I can have bad days. And on the latter, the e-bike is really great because I can back off my effort. I can let the e-bike motor do the work, and therefore I can either get to where I'm going or get back home without overextending myself and then suffering some of those issues due to my stroke. On those bad days, that's one of the few times that I might use the motor on full power. Now, I can imagine for other people, the e-bike might have similar benefits for medical conditions. For instance, if you have a heart condition, your cardiologist may request that you keep your heart rate down. And of course, the e-bike can help you do that. Somebody else I know who has issues with one of their joints means that they don't have to put so much load through their joint, and therefore they don't suffer as much pain. So I think for people with medical conditions, these e-bikes are actually fantastic. That doesn't mean to say I can't ride an acoustic bike. And as you've seen, I actually do ride an acoustic bike. I just have to be much more careful about how I use it, and in particular, not putting in more effort than my body can sustain. I think the simple answer is yes, it is, unsurprisingly. However, the more nuanced answer is it depends. So when I'm riding on my own, yes, the e-bike is a bit faster. That's not really surprising. However, when I'm riding with other people, what tends to happen is that they set the speed, and therefore I get less fatigued and I have less problems with my brain. That's both safer for me and for my club mates, as when I do get tired, my relationship to my surroundings becomes compromised. Now, I haven't de-restricted my e-bike, and I'm not going to. If I did, I can imagine that it could be substantially faster than my acoustic bike. Talking about my acoustic bike, this gravel bike, I really quite enjoy riding that too. That's partly down to the extra comfort, but I think it's also because it feels better when I'm climbing up hills, and that it's really not that much slower than my e-bike when I'm on my own. I'm sorry about the focus pulsing on previous sections of this video. However, I've now changed camera, and I hope that won't happen in this section. At the start of this video, I said I was going to compare and contrast my Orbea Gain e-bike and this, my acoustic gravel bike. Obviously, the big difference between them is one has an electric motor and the other doesn't. However, there are some other more subtle differences that I've discussed earlier. But in summary, the benefit of the e-bike is it does have that motor, which results in not really very much more speed, but it does reduce the amount of fatigue that I suffer, and that allows me to ride for longer distances. And the benefit of the gravel bike really is that it rides much more like a normal bike, probably because it's a bit lighter and the geometry is a bit more lively, and that's particularly noticeable uphill. Another big advantage of this bike is that it's much more comfortable, and that comfort also has a knock-on effect to fatigue as well. So both bikes, both the e-bike and this gravel bike, have their advantages. That's a pretty difficult question for me to answer because I like riding both bikes. So some of those advantages are specific to the particular bikes that I've been looking at, but there are more generic issues as well, and that's the comparison between having a motor and not having a motor. So I suppose a big question is, if I had to choose an e-bike or an acoustic bike, which one would I go for? I would go for the e-bike motor option, and that's for several reasons. First of all, with modern e-bikes, the weight disadvantage isn't that great. I'm talking about 3 to 4 kilos. Now, compared to my body mass, around 90 kilos, that's a relatively small amount. That means it does ride much more like an ordinary acoustic bike. Not quite the same, but more like an acoustic bike. Obviously, the big advantage too is that I have the motor, and that can relieve some of the effort that I have to put in, and I get less fatigued, therefore I can ride longer distances. However, learning from comparing the two bikes that I have, my e-bike's down there by the way, I would want to take aspects of both of them and combine them if I had to have a single bike. So if I was forced to choose, and luckily I don't have to, I would be choosing the Orbea Gain because it's an e-bike. However, I'd be taking some of the aspects of this bike and transferring it to the e-bike. That's mainly about comfort. So on the e-bike, I would put the larger tyres and run them at lower pressures. I'd also probably put that 3D printed saddle on the bike. So that's it then. If I had to choose one bike, I would go for the e-bike. But luckily, I don't have to choose. I can choose the bike that I want for a particular day or conditions. For instance, during the winter, I'll mainly be using my gravel bike, and that's because it's more comfortable. I'll be riding shorter distances, so fatigue is less of a problem, and it also has a bit more of an off-road capability, which I'll tend to use at this time of the year.
Consider subscribing to my channel by touching the 5-minute velo roundel now. If you want to know more about my Orbea Gain, there's a link to my e-biking playlist in the top left, and if you want to know more about my gravel bike, there's a link to the playlist in the top right. From me, until the next video, it's goodbye.